A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
Hey everyone, welcome back to My Weird Prompts. I am Corn Poppleberry, coming to you from our home here in Jerusalem. It is a beautiful day outside. The sun is hitting the stone walls of the old city in that specific way it does in mid-March, but the energy in the city lately has been incredibly intense. You can feel it in the markets, in the cafes, and certainly in the squares. I am joined, as always, by my brother.
Herman Poppleberry here. And yeah, Corn, intense is one way to put it. You can feel the friction in the air when you walk down the street lately. It is like the political climate has reached a boiling point where people are not even speaking the same language anymore. It is not just that people disagree on what should be done. It is that they do not even agree on the basic facts of the reality we are living in. It is a strange time to be an observer of human behavior, especially here.
That ties directly into what we are diving into today. Our housemate Daniel sent us a voice memo earlier this morning that really struck a chord. He was reflecting on the current state of conservative identity, both here in Israel and back in the United States. He mentioned how it feels like we have moved past simple political disagreement into something much more exclusionary. He specifically pointed to the way the hostage return protests here have been framed, where the anger often seems directed more at the government than at the people actually holding the hostages. He sounded genuinely rattled by it, Herman. He felt like his own perspective, which is one of deep concern for the hostages, but also a belief in a strong military response, was being treated as if it were a moral failing rather than a legitimate strategic position.
Daniel is tapping into a very real phenomenon. There is this sense that if you hold conservative views, you are not just wrong on policy, you are somehow morally deficient or outside the bounds of polite society. We have talked about this in passing before, but today I want to really take the engine apart and see how this delegitimization works, because it is not just a feeling. There is a structural mechanism behind that sneer we see from progressive institutions. We are seeing a shift from political debate to moral exclusion. It is a move from saying your ideas are bad to saying your existence in the public square is harmful.
Right, and I think that word delegitimization is the key. It is one thing to say, I think your tax policy is inefficient or your approach to urban planning is flawed. It is another thing entirely to say your worldview is a threat to democracy, and therefore you should not have a seat at the table. So, Herman, let us start there. Why does it feel like the goalposts have shifted from debate to erasure? Why is the current zeitgeist in 2026 so focused on making sure certain voices are not just argued against, but silenced entirely?
Well, if you look at the American zeitgeist over the last few years, and especially what we are seeing in early 2026, there has been a massive shift in how political opposition is categorized. In the past, you had the loyal opposition. You had two sides who both loved the country but had different ideas on how to run it. Today, the progressive left has largely adopted a framework where conservative ideas are framed as harm. Not as bad ideas, but as literal, physical, or psychological harm. This is a crucial distinction. If an idea is just bad, we can talk about it. If an idea is harm, then talking about it is a form of complicity in that harm.
And once you categorize an idea as harm, you do not have to debate it anymore. You just have to stop it. It becomes a matter of safety rather than a matter of opinion.
You've hit on it. It is a brilliant rhetorical move. If I say your support for border security or traditional family structures or a robust national defense is a form of violence against a marginalized group, I have effectively bypassed the need to provide a counter-argument. I have moved the conversation from the realm of politics into the realm of safety. And in the modern West, safety is the ultimate trump card. This creates what I call the moral shield. It allows progressive institutions, whether it is the media, academia, or the bureaucracy, to ignore conservative perspectives entirely because those perspectives are labeled as inherently dangerous. It is a way of saying, we are not censoring you, we are protecting people from you.
I see this playing out vividly with the hostage situation here in Israel. It has been heartbreaking to watch. Everyone wants those people home. Every single person in this country is praying for their return. But the way the protests have been shaped by certain factions is striking from a sociological perspective. They have taken a unified humanitarian tragedy and turned it into a political cudgel against Prime Minister Netanyahu. It is almost as if the primary villain of the story has shifted in the eyes of the protesters from the kidnappers to the elected leader of the country.
It is the same mechanism corn. Instead of the focus being on the pressure that needs to be applied to Hamas, the rhetoric shifts inward. It becomes about the perceived failures of the right-wing government. By doing that, they delegitimize the government's entire strategy for national security. They frame the conservative approach to the war as the primary obstacle to the hostages' freedom rather than the terrorists who kidnapped them. It is a way of saying, your conservative logic of strength and deterrence is not just wrong, it is the reason these people are still in tunnels. It is a total inversion of reality, but it is very effective at making conservatives feel like they are the villains in their own story. It turns a strategic disagreement into a moral indictment.
It creates this incredible psychological weight. If you are a conservative listener, whether you are in Tel Aviv or Tennessee, you are constantly told by the loudest voices in the room that your values are the problem. You are the reason for the gridlock. You are the reason for the social tension. You are the reason for the lack of progress. It is a constant, institutionalized sneer. It is the look on the face of the news anchor, the tone of the HR training video, the subtext of the university lecture. It is everywhere.
And that sneer is meant to induce silence. It is a form of social conditioning. If you know that expressing your support for, say, President Trump or a robust military response to terror will result in you being labeled a bigot or a warmonger by your peers, you are much more likely to keep your mouth shut. It is the spiral of silence in action. But here is the thing that I find so compelling, and it is something we need to highlight today. Despite this intense institutional pressure, the movement is not dying. In fact, in many ways, it is more vital than ever. The resilience of the conservative identity in the face of this total institutional hostility is one of the most underreported stories of the mid-20s.
That is the big paradox. If you only watched the news or scrolled through social media, you would think conservatism was a shrinking fringe movement of angry outliers who are slowly being aged out of the population. But then you look at the actual data, or you look at election results around the world, and you see a very different picture. You see a movement that is actually expanding its reach, even as its status in the elite culture hits an all-time low.
That's it. We are seeing a massive gap between institutional power and electoral reality. Think back to episode 981, where we discussed the opinion gap. We looked at that statistical earthquake in early 2026 regarding American support for Israel. Even as the mainstream media and elite universities became increasingly hostile to the Israeli cause, a huge segment of the American public remained steadfast. They just stopped talking about it in public squares, where they knew they would be shouted down. The data showed that while the volume of anti-Israel rhetoric in the media went up by 400%, the actual support among the American working class barely budged. It just went underground.
So it is a silent majority situation, but with a modern twist. People are retreating into their own information ecosystems because the mainstream one has become a hostile environment. It is not that they are being convinced by the other side. It is that they are being evicted from the conversation.
And it is not just the United States. Look at Europe. You have these nationalist populist movements in Italy, in France, in the Netherlands. These are movements that have been relentlessly mocked and delegitimized by the European Union establishment for a decade. They have been called every name in the book, and yet they keep winning. They keep growing. Why? Because the sneer from the elites eventually loses its power. If you call everyone a fascist for 10 years, eventually the word loses its sting, and people start looking at the actual policies you are failing to deliver on, like economic stability or border control. The reality of a failing neighborhood or a stagnant economy eventually outweighs the fear of being sneered at by a journalist in Brussels.
I think it is also worth noting that conservatism itself is evolving. It is not a monolith. The conservatism of the 1980s is not the conservatism of 2026. Herman, how would you describe the different flavors we are seeing right now? Because I think the way people respond to the sneer depends on which flavor of conservative they are.
That is a great question. We are seeing a real divergence. On one hand, you have the traditionalist institutional conservatives who are still trying to play by the old rules of decorum and consensus. They are often the ones most hurt by the delegitimization because they still crave the approval of the institutions. They want to be respected by the New York Times. But then you have this newer, more populist wing, which is much more prevalent in the Trump-era Republican Party and among the Israeli right. This group has essentially given up on seeking institutional approval. They see the sneer not as a reason to hide, but as a badge of honor. To them, if the establishment hates you, you must be doing something right.
It is almost a counterculture at this point. It has that same energy that the left had in the 60s, where being an outsider was the whole point.
It really is. Being a conservative in a major Western city in 2026 is arguably more countercultural than being a punk rocker was in the 1970s. You are going against the grain of the entire educational and corporate apparatus. If you wear a MAGA hat in downtown Seattle or a pro-settlement shirt in certain parts of Tel Aviv, you are inviting immediate social sanction. And that creates a different kind of person. It creates someone who is more resilient, more skeptical of authority, and more reliant on their own community for validation. It is forging a much tougher, more ideological movement.
This brings up a point about the youth. There is this widespread assumption in the media that young people are naturally progressive, and that conservatism will just eventually age out as the older generations pass away. But we have seen some really surprising data on that recently that completely contradicts that narrative. Remember episode 1342, where we talked about why Israel's youth are defying global political trends?
Oh, that is a perfect example. In almost every Western country, the youth are the engine of the progressive left, but in Israel, the trend is perfectly inverted. The younger generation here is significantly more right-wing and traditional than their parents or grandparents. They have grown up in the shadow of the Second Intifada. They have seen the failures of the peace process, and they have lived through the constant threat of rocket fire. For them, conservative policies on security and national identity are not abstract theories. They are survival mechanisms. They do not care about the sneer of a European intellectual because that intellectual does not have to run to a bomb shelter when the sirens go off.
And I think we're starting to see ripples of that in the West too. As the progressive left moves further toward radicalism, a lot of young people who value things like free speech, meritocracy, or just plain common sense are starting to look elsewhere. They might not call themselves conservatives yet, but they are certainly feeling the brunt of that progressive sneer, and they do not like it. They are seeing their own opportunities limited by equity mandates, or their own speech chilled by campus speech codes. They are becoming reactionary, in the literal sense of the word. They are reacting against an overbearing orthodoxy.
It is a reaction to the overreach. When you try to delegitimize every dissenting opinion, you eventually create a very large and very motivated group of dissenters. The Irish situation we covered in episode 979 is another great case study. We looked at that report from March 2026 showing a 60% increase in anti-Semitic incidents in Ireland. What was notable there was how the institutional righteousness shield was used to mask that hostility. The Irish political class frames their anti-Israel stance as a moral crusade for human rights, which then creates a permissive environment for actual anti-Semitism to flourish. When conservatives point this out, they are sneered at and told they are just trying to deflect from human rights abuses. It is a perfect closed loop of delegitimization.
It is a circular logic that is very hard to break out of from the inside. If you are a conservative in Ireland trying to speak up about this, you are fighting against a government and a media that have already decided you are the one with the moral blind spot. You are being told that your concern for Jewish safety is actually just a cover for your supposed right-wing bigotry. It is gaslighting on an institutional scale.
That's the core of it. So the question becomes, how do you respond to that? How do you maintain your identity and your sanity when the world around you is constantly telling you that you are illegitimate? How do you stay grounded when the very institutions that are supposed to be neutral, the courts, the schools, the press, have clearly picked a side and that side considers you the enemy?
That is the million-dollar question, Herman. Because the psychological toll is real. I know so many people, including Daniel, who feel exhausted by it. They feel like they have to hide their views at work, or they avoid certain topics with their friends because they do not want to be the target of that contempt. It is lonely to feel like you are the only one who sees the world a certain way, even when you know millions of others agree with you.
I think the first step is what I call intellectual decoupling. You have to stop looking to legacy institutions for your sense of moral or intellectual worth. If the New York Times or the BBC or the local university faculty lounge thinks you are a bad person because you believe in national sovereignty or the importance of borders, you have to reach a point where their opinion simply does not matter to you. You have to realize that their sneer is not a reflection of your character, but a tool of their own power preservation. Once you stop seeking their validation, the sneer loses its sting. It is like a superpower.
That is easier said than done, though. We are social creatures. We want to be respected by the people around us. We want to feel like we are part of the mainstream.
It is incredibly hard, but that is why building parallel structures is so important, and we are seeing this happen in real time in 2026. We are seeing the rise of independent media, alternative social platforms, and new educational initiatives. People are finding ways to bypass the gatekeepers entirely. This podcast is a tiny part of that. We are having a conversation that would probably be edited or framed very differently on a mainstream network. We are creating a space where these ideas can be explored without the immediate threat of cancellation or moral condemnation.
Definitely. We have the freedom to actually explore the nuances of why someone might support President Trump, or why someone might be skeptical of the current protest movement in Israel without having to constantly apologize for it or couch it in 15 layers of progressive qualifiers. We can just look at the data and the logic.
And that is the vitality Daniel was asking about. The movement is strong because it is being forged in fire. When you are constantly under attack, you have to be very clear about what you believe and why you believe it. You cannot afford to be lazy in your thinking. I actually think the conservative movement today is intellectually sharper than it has been in decades, precisely because it has to be. If you are a conservative in 2026, you have to be an amateur historian, a sociologist, and a debater just to survive a dinner party.
That is an interesting perspective. The pressure is actually making the ideas more robust. It is like an evolutionary process where only the strongest arguments survive.
Think about it. If you are a progressive in a modern university, your ideas are never challenged. You are surrounded by people who agree with you, and any dissent is silenced. Your intellectual muscles atrophy because they are never used. But if you are a conservative in that same environment, every single day is a debate. You have to know the data, you have to understand the counter arguments, and you have to be able to articulate your position under extreme pressure. Who do you think is going to be a more effective advocate in the long run? The person who has never been challenged, or the person who has been fighting for their intellectual life every day?
It is like weight training for the mind. But there is a danger there too, isn't there? Of becoming too reactionary? Of letting the opposition define you? If you are always fighting, you might forget what you were fighting for in the first place.
That is the biggest trap. If you spend all your time reacting to the latest progressive outrage or trying to own the libs, you lose sight of what you are actually for. Conservatism should be about preserving the things that work, about honoring tradition, and about building a stable future. It should be a positive vision, not just a mirror image of the left's hostility. We have to be careful not to adopt the same sneer ourselves. If we become just as exclusionary and just as contemptuous as the people we are criticizing, then we have already lost.
I think that is a really important point. If we respond to contempt with more contempt, we are just contributing to the degradation of the entire political system. The goal should be to maintain our principles with a certain level of dignity, even when that dignity is not being reciprocated. It is about being the adult in the room, even when the room is screaming at you.
Strategic patience is the other key. We have to understand that these institutional shifts happen in long cycles. The long march through the institutions that the left undertook took decades. It will not be undone overnight. But we are already seeing the cracks. When institutions become too ideological, they stop being effective. They stop solving problems. They become more focused on policing thought than on delivering results. And eventually, the public notices. Whether it is the rising crime in American cities or the inability of European governments to manage their borders, the reality eventually punctures the ideological bubble. People can only be told that things are fine for so long before they look out their window and see that they are not.
And that is when the sneer starts to look like panic. When the people in power realize that their rhetoric no longer matches the lived experience of the population, they tend to get more aggressive, not less.
I think a lot of the hostility we are seeing right now in 2026 is actually a sign of weakness, not strength. If your ideas were truly dominant and successful, you would not need to delegitimize your opponents. You would just beat them with better results. You would point to your thriving cities and your secure borders and your unified population and say, look, our way works. The fact that the left is relying so heavily on social exclusion, censorship, and moral condemnation suggests that they know their grip on the public's imagination is slipping. They are trying to hold on to power through social pressure because they can no longer hold it through performance.
Let us talk about the practical takeaways for our listeners. If you are someone like Daniel, who feels this pressure every day, what can you actually do? How do you live as a conservative in a world that seems determined to make you feel like an outcast?
First, find your community. Do not be an island. Whether it is a local group, an online forum, or just a few friends you can be honest with, you need a space where you do not have to self-censor. It is vital for your mental health to know that you are not crazy and you are not alone. Second, stay informed through diverse sources. Do not let the legacy media define the boundaries of what is acceptable to think. Read the papers, look at the primary data, and listen to podcasts like this one that are not afraid to go against the grain. Knowledge is the best defense against gaslighting.
And I would add, do not be afraid to speak up, but do it with grace. You do not have to be a firebrand. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is just calmly state your position and refuse to be shamed for it. When people see that you are a rational, decent human being who happens to have conservative views, it breaks the caricature that the media has built. It makes it much harder for them to maintain the sneer when they are looking at a person they actually respect.
That is so true. The sneer relies on turning us into monsters or caricatures. If you refuse to play the part, if you remain kind and thoughtful and firm in your convictions, the whole thing falls apart. And finally, have some perspective. We are part of a global movement that represents hundreds of millions of people. We are not a fringe. We are not a dying breed. We are a fundamental part of the human experience. The desire for order, for tradition, for national identity, and for individual responsibility is not going anywhere. It is hardwired into the human soul.
It really is. And looking at the resilience of the movement here in Israel, despite everything we have been through over the last couple of years, it is actually quite inspiring. People are still standing up for what they believe in. They are still building, they are still fighting for their country, and they are still holding on to their values, even when the entire international community is telling them they are wrong. That kind of courage is contagious.
It is a marathon, not a sprint. And I think we are better positioned for the long haul than people realize. The very things that make us deplorable in the eyes of the elite, our loyalty to our families, our faith, and our nations, are the very things that give us the strength to endure. Those are the things that provide real meaning, and meaning is a much more powerful motivator than social approval.
Well said, Herman. I think we have covered a lot of ground today. From the mechanics of delegitimization to the global resilience of the movement and the specific challenges we are seeing here on the ground in Jerusalem. It is a complex time to be a conservative, but it is also a time of great clarity if you know where to look. We are seeing the lines being drawn very clearly, and that allows us to know exactly where we stand.
It really does. And I want to thank Daniel for sending in that prompt. It is something that has been on my mind a lot lately, and it was good to really dig into it. It is important to name these things, to call out the sneer for what it is, a tool of power, not a reflection of truth.
I agree. And to all our listeners out there, we know it can be tough navigating this climate. We appreciate you being part of this community. If you are enjoying the show, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It genuinely helps other people find us and helps the show grow. We are building something here, and every review is a brick in that wall.
Yeah, those reviews make a huge difference. And remember, you can find all our past episodes, including the ones we referenced today, at myweirdprompts.com. We have an RSS feed there if you want to subscribe directly, and you can also find us on Telegram. Just search for My Weird Prompts to get notified every time a new episode drops. We are trying to build those parallel structures we talked about, and your support is what makes that possible.
We are also always looking for more prompts. So if there is a topic you want us to explore, head over to the website and use the contact form. We love hearing from you. Whether you are in a high-rise in New York or a small town in the Galilee, we want to hear what you are seeing and feeling.
We really do. For those interested in the deep dive into the Irish data we mentioned, check out episode 979. It is a real eye-opener on how institutional rhetoric can be used to shield some pretty ugly things. And episode 1342 on the Israeli youth is a great one for when you are feeling pessimistic about the future. The kids are all right. They are more grounded in reality than the people trying to teach them.
They really are. Before we head out, Herman, do you think we are going to see more of those protests this weekend?
Probably. They seem to be ramping up as the political pressure mounts. But the conversation is shifting. People are starting to ask more questions about who is funding them and what the actual goal is. It will be notable to see how it plays out in the coming weeks. The sneer only works as long as the people being sneered at believe they are alone. Once they realize they are part of a global majority, the whole dynamic changes. The power shifts back to the people.
Right. All right, let us go get some lunch. I think Daniel is actually making something today to make up for his gloomy voice memo. I hope it is shakshuka. You know how fast he eats when he is stressed.
Very true. We should definitely hurry. Stay strong out there. Do not let the sneer get you down.
This has been My Weird Prompts. I am Corn Puppleberry.
And I am Herman Poppleberry.
Thanks for listening, and we will talk to you in the next one. Take care, everyone.
Bye for now.
Goodbye.
Bye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts.